we tend to picture humanity's global movement as a single, relatively recent event, a grand departure from Africa by modern humans a few tens of thousands of years ago. Yet buried deep in the archaeological record whispered by ancient stone lies a bolder and far older truth. The story of our ancestors leaving Africa began not in millennia, but in millions of years. That deeper reality shatters the tidy narrative, and it raises the question that runs through this entire story. When did humanity truly leave Africa? And was it one decisive moment, or something far more ancient and tangled than we imagine? To answer it, we have to trace not one path, but many, across continents, through epochs of violent environmental change, and across more than one kind of human. We will follow pioneering hominids like the robust, adaptable Homo erectus as they spread out of Africa. Creatures with growing intelligence, evolving tools, and the endurance to cross deserts and mountains, charting routes deep into Asia and Europe, sometimes a million years before our own species had even begun to take shape. To understand that long-forgotten prologue, we must first return to the restless continent that forged these first travelers. Africa was humanity's undisputed cradle for millions of years. Here our ancestors took their first upright steps, chipped the earliest crude stone tools, and slowly grew larger brains and more flexible minds. But the stage was never static. Africa's landscapes were relentlessly reworked by climate, forests fragmenting, savannas expanding and contracting, lakes filling and drying. Between roughly 3 and 2 million years ago, these upheavals grew especially severe, forcing shifts in diet, cutting populations off from familiar resources, turning water into an unpredictable quest. Such instability squeezed and stretched hominid groups, sharpening their adaptability and pushing them into ever-new territory in search of food and water. The continent became a forging ground for resilience itself. But who exactly were the hominids capable of turning that pressure into a journey beyond the continent altogether? That question leads to a pivotal moment roughly 2 million years ago, with the emergence of a new kind of hominid, Homo erectus, and its early African form, Homo ergaster. It had a larger brain, more capable tool-making hands, and crucially, a tall, long-limbed body built for efficient, sustained walking. This was a hominid that could cover vast distances and thrive across a startling range of environments, the first truly equipped not just to move but to keep moving far beyond the landscapes that had shaped it. For generations, though, the true antiquity of its first great departure stayed hidden, obscured by a timeline that simply couldn't imagine such ancient pioneers. Then the soil of distant lands began to challenge that certainty. Scattered across Eurasia, archaeologists kept turning up not the expected fossil bones, but something subtler and just as undeniable: simple stones, deliberately flaked, unmistakably worked by hominid hands. These crude tools, far from Africa's cradle, were silent witnesses to an unwritten chapter, hinting at pioneers who had crossed vast distances not tens of thousands of years ago, but on a far grander scale. Which forces a pointed question: what specific evidence first pushed the timeline for hominins outside Africa back by such an astonishing margin? The answer came from the wind-blown loess of Shangchen in central China. Stone tools sealed in layers dated to 12 million years ago. Crudely flaked river cobbles and sharp-edged flakes. They were buried across 17 distinct sediment layers, each a precise marker of time, and they are the earliest known trace of any hominin anywhere beyond Africa. The discovery pushed the timeline back by nearly 500,000 years and shattered assumptions about early hominin range. To find such clear evidence of occupation on the far side of Asia, a world away from the African savanna and long before Homo sapiens existed, meant these ancestors were capable of far more than anyone had granted them. Yet the very anonymity of these travelers, known only by their handiwork, opened a new mystery. Shangchen yielded tools and nothing else. No skulls, no teeth, no bones. Who were these pioneers who reached the far side of Asia more than 2 million years ago? Their handiwork proved they had crossed thousands of kilometers of unfamiliar, often harsh terrain, but it could not tell scientists what manner of creature had done it. To put a face to these ancient travelers, researchers needed a fossil. That face emerged far to the west at a hilltop site called Dmanisi in the Caucasus Mountains of Georgia. There, ancient sediment had cradled what Shangchen could not offer: actual hominin remains, a direct, physical link to some of the very first people to leave Africa. And what those remains revealed would overturn a deep assumption about the journey itself. At Dmanisi, researchers unearthed a remarkable cluster of fossils, superbly preserved and securely dated to between 185 and 177 million years ago, the oldest human ancestors known anywhere outside Africa. Grouped with Homo erectus, these individuals were startling. Their brains were small, just 545 to 775 cubic centimeters, and their bodies retained many primitive traits. The long-held belief that a large, complex brain was the prerequisite for leaving Africa collapsed on the spot. The engine of dispersal Dmanisi showed was never superior intellect. It was raw resilience and adaptability, the capacity to adjust, to scavenge, to defend, and to endure in hostile new lands. These people had not merely wandered out of Africa, they had settled and survived, cementing Dmanisi as the cornerstone of what scientists call Out of Africa I, the ancient prologue to every migration that followed. The Dmanisi bones hold an even more intimate detail. Among the 5 skulls recovered is one, sometimes called Skull 5. That is the most complete early human cranium ever found, and another that belonged to an individual who had lost nearly all of their teeth years before death. The jawbone healed smooth where the sockets had closed over. A toothless hominid could not have chewed the tough foods of an Ice Age winter alone. That this person survived so long suggests others helped them, softening food, sharing it. A faint but startling hint of care and cooperation among these small-brained pioneers, nearly 2 million years ago. But how did such archaic beings, armed with only simple flaked stone Oldowan tools, conquer the cold, seasonal, predator-rich world of the Caucasus, an entirely new ecological realm of unfamiliar plants, different prey, and brutal, snow-laden winters, so far removed from the rhythms of Africa? Their endurance in such conditions forces a closer look at the forces that propelled these journeys. What environmental shifts and what deep advantages of body and behavior let them not just reach but thrive so far from home? Much of the answer lies in climate, acting like a vast pump. Again and again, over immense spans of time, wet phases transformed the deserts of the Sahara and Arabia, normally impassable barriers, into green expanses laced with lakes, grass, and migrating game. In those windows, the gates swung open, letting animals and the hominids who followed them flow north and east. When the rains failed, the desert slammed shut behind them. Human dispersal was never one continuous march but a series of pulses, timed to the opening and closing of these fleeting green worlds. And of all the corridors this pump opened, one mattered above the rest. That gateway was the Levantine Corridor, the narrow bridge of land running up from Egypt through the Sinai into the Middle East. It was the hinge between two continents, and it breathed with the climate, an arid, deadly barrier in dry times, a lush, walkable green highway when the rains returned. Through this pulsing doorway, wave after wave of hominins slipped out of Africa, following ribbons of water and migrating herds eastward, and along it, in what is now Israel, lies the site of Ubaidiya. Dating to roughly 5 million years ago, Ubaidiya is a window onto one of these early waves, capturing not just the traveler's presence, but a snapshot of how they lived and what they carried. A clear thread of movement running from Africa into the heart of the Middle East. Its significance deepened in 2022 when researchers described a 5 million year old hominin vertebra from the site, among the oldest human remains in the region, and a hint of a larger-bodied traveler than the Manisi people. Just as telling were the tools. Acheulean hand axes, a clear leap beyond the simpler Oldowan flakes of earlier waves. Bone and blade together revealed a capable expansion, propelled by a sharpening toolkit and adapted body, and climate's open gates. The full reach of Homo erectus proved staggering. Their bones and tools trace a path not only into the Caucasus, but deep into Southeast Asia, reaching the island of Java by around 7 million years ago, and scattering across China from 7 to 6 million years ago, building on the older tool-only hints at Shangchen. To span from Africa to the eastern edge of Asia, across deserts, forests, mountains, and rivers, with such a modest toolkit was a remarkable feat. And it raises a fundamental question. What interlinked advantages gave Homo erectus the edge to colonize so many wildly different worlds? The edge was never a single gift, but a combination. It was an adaptable body built for endurance, an evolving tool tradition spanning crude Oldowan flakes and refined Acheulean hand axes, and a behavioral flexibility that let them read and exploit unfamiliar environments. Finding food and shelter far from Africa. Over time, the growing mastery of fire, whose firmest early traces appear later in their long reign, added warmth, protection from predators, and the ability to cook, unlocking new nutrients and softening tough plants. This blend of ingenuity and adaptability, not sheer intellect, let Homo erectus build humanity's first global presence. The strangest testament to that reach lies on the Indonesian island of Flores. There, isolated for hundreds of thousands of years beyond deep water straits, a population of these early hominins evolved into something extraordinary. Homo floresiensis, a diminutive human barely a meter tall, with a brain no larger than a chimpanzee's, yet still making tools and hunting. Nicknamed the Hobbit, it is a vivid illustration of island dwarfism, and of just how far, and how strangely, the descendants of those first travelers diverged once the sea sealed them off from the rest of the world. It is also a reminder that these were branches, not our trunk. Nor was Flores unique. On the Philippine island of Luzon, another dwarfed and puzzling hominin, Homo luzonensis, survived until perhaps 50,000 years ago, a second island experiment in what the human form could become when the sea left it alone. Yet, for all that reach, Homo erectus did not give rise to the peoples who fill the world today. Their sprawling, long-lived success was, in the deepest sense, a separate branch on the human family tree. Our own line did not spring from them, which leaves a haunting gap. If Homo erectus mastered so much of the globe for over 1 million years, why did their expansion not simply become us? And where does the global journey of our own species really begin? For more than 1 million years, Homo erectus and its descendants roamed Eurasia, giving rise in the north to lineages like the Neanderthals. But back in Africa, evolution never paused. Within the shifting mosaic of expanding savannas and shrinking forests, new pressures refined the populations that stayed, not toward brute endurance, but toward subtler cognitive flexibility and anatomical change. Slowly, a new kind of hominid was taking shape. That lineage was Homo sapiens. Somewhere between roughly 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans emerged across Africa. Not at a single point, but through a continent-wide process, as finds like the 300,000-year-old remains from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco make clear. Populations in different regions gradually acquired our lighter build, smaller faces, and minds of unprecedented complexity. From that African crucible came a species poised to expand as no hominid had before, and Africa in this age was no stage with a single actor. Deep in a South African cave system called Rising Star, explorers found the bones of Homo naledi, a small-brained hominin, its skull barely a third the size of ours, that nonetheless appears to have carried its dead deliberately into the dark. Astonishingly, it lived not millions of years ago, but only around 250,000 to 335,000 years back, meaning it may have shared the continent with the very first Homo sapiens. Africa was not a tidy ladder climbing toward us, but a crowded, branching bush of humanity. Several kinds of hominin alive at once, and only one of them destined to inherit the earth. Homo sapiens carried the same ancient imperatives as every hominid before: the push of climate, the pull of hunger, the search for new ground, but paired them with a widening capacity for complex planning, cooperation across groups, and abstract thought. These were the advantages that would, in time, carry our species to the farthest reaches of the planet. But the Great Dispersal was not our first attempt. There were earlier, more tentative steps which posed their own question. When did we, Homo sapiens, first try to cross the threshold out of Africa? Many times, as it turns out, long before the major expansion. These were not decisive marches but sporadic, often short-lived forays, most of which ultimately faded out, and they were not ventures into empty land. Eurasia was already home to other humans, above all the Neanderthals, who had adapted to the cold, seasonal rhythms of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. On the edges of Africa and within the Levantine corridor, these distinct kinds of human came face to face. In encounters far stranger and more intimate than anyone once guessed. It is worth pausing on who the Neanderthals really were, because the brutish caricature is long dead. They were master survivors of the Ice Age. Stocky, powerfully built, cold-adapted, with brains as large as our own or larger. They knapped sophisticated tools, controlled fire, hunted big game in coordinated groups, cared for their injured, buried their dead, and left behind pigments and ornaments that hint at symbolic thought. For hundreds of thousands of years they, not we, were Europe's humans. Any account of Homo sapiens spreading into Eurasia is also the story of meeting a confident, capable people already at home there. The proof is written in ancient DNA. When scientists sequenced Neanderthal genomes, they found the fingerprints of contact reaching deep into time. An African lineage related to early Homo sapiens appears to have passed genes into Neanderthals as far back as roughly 200,000 to 250,000 years ago. It was a startling signal that the ancestors of our species were meeting and mixing with their Eurasian cousins long before the main exodus. For a long time, such genetic echoes were the only hint of these ancient journeys, until a fossil put a physical face on them. That face came from Millennia Cave, high on Mount Carmel in Israel, an upper jawbone, its full set of teeth, unequivocally those of a modern human, dated to between about 175,000 and 200,000 years old. In an instant, it pushed the known presence of Homo sapiens beyond Africa back by at least 50,000 years, far earlier than any textbook timeline had allowed. But the solved mystery raised a sharper paradox. How could anatomically modern humans be sitting in the Levant nearly 200,000 years ago and yet leave no lasting trace in the ancestry of today's world? The resolution is that these movements came not as one continuous flood, but as multiple, intermittent pulses. Many early Homo sapiens populations pushed out of Africa, faltered against environments unlike anything at home, and died back or died out as climates shifted and resources vanished. The Millennia jawbone is not a paradox, but a poignant record of one such wave, ambitious, far-reaching, and ultimately impermanent. Nor was it alone. Tens of thousands of years later, at the nearby caves of Skul and Kafse, modern humans buried their dead around 90,000 to 120,000 years ago. And then, during a subsequent cold, dry phase, the Levant's modern humans seemed to vanish from the record, replaced by Neanderthals moving down from the north. An early foothold, won and then lost. Which sharpens the deepest question of all. If modern humans left Africa this early, and more than once, why do nearly all present-day non-Africans trace their ancestry to a single, much later migration? Part of the answer is who was already there. As early Homo sapiens edged into Eurasia, they entered a continent long claimed by the Neanderthals, formidable occupants adapted to a world far harsher than Africa. When the two lineages met, the encounters were neither isolated nor one-sided, and the genomes record more than one of them. A later pulse of gene flow, this time from Homo sapiens into the ancestors of the Siberian, or Altai, Neanderthals around 100,000 to 120,000 years ago, shows these were repeated contacts across successive waves. Not a clean replacement of one humankind by another, but a braided history of coexistence and interbreeding. And the most consequential of all still lay ahead, waiting for the wave that would finally stick. For here is the shape of the whole puzzle. Homo erectus spread across the old world but became a branch our line did not descend from. Early Homo sapiens reached Eurasia but faltered, leaving genes in Neanderthals, yet no lasting population of their own. Neither the ancient pioneers nor the first modern probes became the ancestors of today's global humanity. Our worldwide family tree springs instead from a single later surge, and the question is what made that one wave different from every failure before it. The deepest driver, once again, was climate. The great swings of the last ice age, throwing open and slamming shut Africa's northern and eastern gates. In warm, wet intervals, the deserts bloomed into navigable ribbons of grass and water. In cold, dry ones, they reverted to lethal barriers. This time, the ancestors of nearly all present-day non-Africans happened to move during a window when the doors stood open at just the right moment for a sustained push. Exactly which door they used is still debated. Some evidence favors the northern route through Sinai, other data points south, across the narrow Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the mouth of the Red Sea, and both may have been used at different times. But route alone was never the whole story. Earlier waves had used the same gates and still faltered. So what convergence of climate, technology, and human capability finally turned a tentative exodus into a permanent planet-spanning conquest? That convergence produced what scientists call Out of Africa 2, the expansion at the heart of the recent African origin model. Sometime around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, a wave of Homo sapiens moved out of East Africa and simply kept going, and this time it held. Genetic studies confirm that nearly every person alive today outside Africa descends from that single surge. It was the moment the whole world opened to our species. Remarkably, the group that carried it may have been small. The genomes of living non-Africans point back to a founding population perhaps only in the thousands, which is why people outside Africa still carry noticeably less genetic diversity than those within it. We are, almost all of us, descended from a modest band of travelers. And the world they crossed into was violent. Around 74,000 years ago, as this dispersal was gathering, the Toba supervolcano in Sumatra erupted in the largest blast of the last 2 million years, veiling the sky and, by one long popular theory, throttling humanity to the edge of extinction. That catastrophe theory is now contested. Stone tools lie both beneath and above Toba's ash at Jwalapuram in India, hinting that people simply carried on, but it captures the truth that our ancestors made their decisive move through a harsh and unstable world, not a welcoming one. This was no hesitant probe, but a relentless expansion. Its likeliest engine was the coast itself, following the shoreline of the Indian Ocean out of the Horn of Africa, along the rim of Arabia, past India, and on toward Southeast Asia. Pioneering bands could move quickly through a single familiar kind of habitat, living on shellfish and stranded resources that never ran out. This southern dispersal hugged productive coastlines rich in food and fresh water, and it spread with surprising speed along the southern rim of Asia. The travelers were carried above all by dense, cooperative social networks, not lone wanderers but interconnected communities that pooled knowledge, shared resources, and spread risk, letting them push through deserts, jungles, and mountains that had turned back earlier, less organized waves. But to go further still, they would have to master a far more formidable barrier. That barrier was the open sea. Beyond the Sunda Shelf, the exposed landmass of Ice Age Southeast Asia, lay the deep water channels of Wallacea, ocean gaps that never closed, impassable even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age. To cross them implies not accidental raft drifting but deliberate, planned voyages, with purpose-built watercraft and real navigation. This was humanity's first true mastery of the open ocean, shattering the assumption that early humans were bound to the land and opening the way to continents once thought forever beyond reach. By around 50,000 years ago, and by some evidence as early as 65, Homo sapiens had crossed those waters to reach Sahul, the Ice Age supercontinent that joined Australia and New Guinea into one landmass. This was a wholly different achievement from the settlement of the remote Pacific Islands, which lay tens of thousands of years in the future. To colonize an entire continent reachable only by sea marked a threshold no earlier hominid had ever crossed. Proof of planning, cooperation, and cultural ingenuity on a new scale. At rock shelters like Majedbe in northern Australia, ground-edge stone tools and ochre crayons speak of people settled and thriving tens of thousands of years ago. The descendants of those first Australians would go on to maintain one of the longest continuous cultures on Earth, an unbroken thread of human presence stretching from the Ice Age into the present day. Turning west and north, Homo sapiens pressed into Europe by around 45,000 to 40,000 years ago, into the long-held heartland of the Neanderthals. For thousands of years, the two shared the same landscapes, hunted the same game, sheltered in the same caves, a complex coexistence of competition and contact, rather than simple replacement. It was in the earlier Middle Eastern leg of this very expansion, roughly 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, that the most consequential interbreeding occurred. Unlike the fleeting, ghostly pulses that came before, this mixing embedded Neanderthal DNA permanently into our ancestors' lineage, the roughly 2% that survives in nearly every non-African person alive today. And then, within a few thousand years of our arrival, the Neanderthals were gone, their last known traces fading around 40,000 years ago. Whether they were outcompeted, absorbed through interbreeding, undone by a harshening climate, or some mixture of all three is still fiercely debated. But the outcome was stark. After hundreds of thousands of years as Europe's humans, they vanished, leaving their genes scattered inside us as their only living descendants. One vast frontier still remained. As the Ice Age locked up the world's water and dropped the seas, a broad plain of land called Beringia emerged between Siberia and Alaska, and its first human occupants may have lingered there, isolated, for thousands of years before pushing on. Sometime after roughly 20,000 years ago, by some evidence earlier still, small bands of Homo sapiens crossed into a double continent that had never known a human footfall. Fossilized footprints preserved at White Sands in New Mexico may record children and adults walking there more than 21,000 years ago. Far to the south, sites like Monteverde in Chile show people had reached the tip of South America not long after. From that entry, humans spread the entire length of the Americas in a geological instant, filling the last great habitable landmass on Earth. With it, our species had reached nearly every corner of the planet under its own power. A spread no other large animal has ever matched. What powered that spread was not a bigger body or a sharper claw, but a mind that had crossed some threshold of imagination. This was the age when symbolic culture truly blossomed. Painters pressed handprints and conjured herds of animals onto cave walls from Sulawesi to southern France. Artisans carved figurines, strung shell beads, and buried their dead with ornament and intent. The toolkit exploded into specialized forms: slender blades, bone needles for stitching tailored clothing warm enough for the Ice Age, and projectile weapons that let a hunter strike from a safe distance. Above all, these people traded materials and stories across hundreds of kilometers, knitting scattered bands into networks that carried knowledge farther than any single life could travel. It was this flowering of art, planning, and shared memory, as much as any change in climate, that let our ancestors improvise their way across every environment on Earth. So the decisive success was forged not by any single ingredient, but by a convergence of them. Flexible, far-reaching social networks that pooled knowledge and risk. Symbolic communication and art that let learning accumulate across generations into an adaptable culture. Refined, specialized toolkits for a wider range of tasks and environments. And the good fortune of favorable climate corridors opening at the right moments. Together, these gave Homo sapiens the decisive edge, not merely to survive in new lands, as earlier hominids had, but to keep expanding until they had claimed every habitable continent on Earth. From the crude flakes of Shangchen to the seagoing voyages that reached Sahul, this is a staggering chronicle of survival across an almost unimaginable span of time, and a story of several kinds of human, not one. Some, like the people of Millennia, pushed out and faltered, dissolving back into the fossil record. Others, like Homo erectus, carved out vast ranges only to become separate branches on the family tree. Just one final surge, ours, eventually connected every habitable corner of the globe. And everywhere that surge arrived, the world itself began to change. Not long after people reached Australia, its giant marsupials, rhino-sized grazers, towering kangaroos, a flightless bird larger than an ostrich, disappeared. As humans spread through the Americas, the mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats that had ruled those continents for ages vanished as well. How much of this was our doing, and how much the whipsaw of a changing climate is still argued, and the truth is likely both at once. But the pattern is haunting. Wherever this new kind of human walked, the largest animals tended to fade soon after. The exodus that peopled the planet was also the first time a single species left its footprint on the whole living world, a role we have never since relinquished. And that tangled history is now written into living cells. As the great wave spread, it interbred not only with Neanderthals, but further east, with the Denisovans, a mysterious human population known almost entirely from DNA teased out of a single finger bone and a few teeth in a remote Siberian cave. Our ancestors met them deep in the Asian interior and mixed. Today, Denisovan ancestry survives most strongly in the peoples of New Guinea and Australia, who carry several % of it still. The Denisovans are a genuine ghost, identified in 2010 from a single fingertip bone in Denisova Cave, later joined by a few teeth, a jawbone from the Tibetan Plateau, and even the remains of a girl whose mother was Neanderthal and father Denisovan. A first-generation hybrid caught in the rock, and their legacy is not merely historical. A Denisovan gene variant passed to the ancestors of modern Tibetans helps them thrive at oxygen-thin altitudes today. An extinct humankind is, in a real sense, still keeping people alive on the roof of the world. We are not the product of one clean lineage, but a mosaic woven from the genes of several distinct kinds of human. And yet, for all the branching of that mosaic, its deepest roots remain in one place. Because everyone outside Africa descends from a single small wave, the whole of humanity beyond the continent is genetically a slender offshoot. while Africa itself preserves the oldest, richest, most varied human ancestry on Earth. Two people from different African populations can differ from each other more in their DNA than either differs from someone on the far side of the world. The full sweep of our species' history is written most completely there. In the cradle we never fully left, for a large part of humanity remained in Africa through every chapter of this story, and their descendants carry the deepest memory of who we are. The Exodus, in the end, was only ever one branch of a far larger tree still growing at its source. That mosaic tells us something fundamental about the drive that carried us across the world. It was never arbitrary wanderlust, but a response to real and relentless pressures, to climates that opened and closed the planet's gates, to the search for food, water, and safer ground, and to minds and bodies flexible enough to seize the narrow windows of opportunity when they appeared. Our journey out of Africa was never a single, sudden departure. It was a vast, multi-million-year epic of pressure, ingenuity, and persistence, of trying, failing, and ultimately prevailing. That is the true answer to where humanity's exodus begins, not in one moment, but in millions of years of movement. Every one of us carries that journey within. The DNA in your cells records the routes your ancestors walked, the archaic humans they met and mingled with, the bottlenecks where survival hung by a thread, Neanderthals in the frigid west, Denisovans in the distant east, their ancient genes living on in millions today. And those inherited fragments are not idle passengers. Neanderthal variants still shape the immune systems, the skin, and the hair of living people, and influence susceptibility to certain diseases. Denisovan genes tune the blood of Tibetans to thin mountain air. In a very real sense, extinct humans are still at work inside our bodies. Their long-vanished adaptations quietly helping us survive. It is a silent record confirming that, whatever our modern differences, all of humanity shares a single, relatively recent origin in Africa, and a family tree braided from the same deep migrations. And the story is still being rewritten in real time. Every field season a new fossil, a freshly dated tool, or a genome pulled from a scrap of ancient bone forces the map to be redrawn, pushing dates back, adding waves, revealing ghost populations we never suspected. Ancient DNA has transformed the field within a single generation, so completely that its pioneer, Svante Pabo, who first sequenced the Neanderthal genome and revealed the Denisovans from little more than a fingertip bone, was awarded a Nobel Prize in 2022 for opening this window onto our extinct relatives. Techniques that did not exist a lifetime ago now let us read the genomes of people dead for tens of thousands of years. And each one rewrites a little more of the map. But through all the revisions, the deepest truth only sharpens. To be human is to move, to adapt, and to reach across distance and difference. And the boundaries we draw between peoples today are shallow scratches over an astonishingly recent and profoundly shared past. The odyssey of our ancestors is, in the end, the story of how we all became one widely scattered family, one whose journey is still even now unfolding.